right, so tonight we have a wonderful presentation by author of this wonderful book, which is for sale in our gift store tonight, if you'd like to grab a copy. Gregory Smithers is a professor of American history in the College of Humanities and Sciences, the Department of History, Virginia Commonwealth University, whose research and teaching focuses on the histories of indigenous people and African Americans from the 18th century to the present. His work is particularly interested in the rich history of the Cherokee people, the indigenous history from the mountains south to California and the Southwest Pacific, environmental history, and the history of race, gender, and sexuality. His most recent book is Reclaiming Two Spirits, Sexuality, Spiritual Renewal, and Sovereignty in Native America. Professor Smithers is currently working on a history of waterways in Cherokee history. Funded by the British Academy, this research includes an interactive website entitled Cherokee Riverkeepers, a collaboration with the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of Sheffield. So, Professor Smithers.
Plenty of room. Thank you. Is the mic working? Yes? Okay. I'm mainly concerned about the people in cyberspace. You guys can hear me. Thank you for coming. Happy Pride Month. It's lovely to be back in person. There's just something so gross and artificial about online stuff, so it's nice to see people's faces and responses to my bad jokes when I tell them, invariably. I'm going to start this evening firstly taking you back to 1825. 1825, think about this in relation to American policy as it relates to Native people, particularly in the Southeast. There's a growing movement for the removal of indigenous people from their homeland so that slavery can expand ever westward. Right, so Native people are really feeling the pressure of this. But in the midst of this, white people, white settlers and Native people are still coming across each other and interacting on the many trading paths that crisscross the American South. So on one of these, up in the Blue Ridge, or down in the Blue Ridge, given where we are, 1825, a white settler who's a little bit lost, actually, comes across 3 or 4 Cherokees just walking their horses along this trail, and they get to talking. Despite what Hollywood movies tell us, people still did talk to each other across racial, ethnic, cultural lines in the 1820s, despite the politics of removal. So they got to talking, and one of the things they started talking about was this ancient tradition that Cherokees used to have, where men would dress as women and take on the roles of women. And according to the settlers, a whole lot of mystery about this, because the Cherokees didn't really know why people used to do this. It's a curious document. That's all you get, is basically a line and a half in an archival document in the Georgetown archives, penned by, I'm not going to tell you who penned it, because you've got to buy the book to find that out. Well, I will say he became a very prominent Detroit business person. That's all I'll say. Otherwise, buy the book. And he's talking about the cultures and the strange ways of the Cherokee and other native Indians, as he called them. What struck me about this one particular line and a half in this densely written handwritten manual, 1825, maybe 26, we're not really sure, was that he mentioned this at all, that there used to be Cherokee men who took on the dress of women and performed the roles of women. Because even by 1825, there had been a long history of colonial invasion and violence towards people who seemed to transform their gender identities and gender roles within Native communities. And some of that violence, as I'll talk about, was physically genocidal. There's archival genocide that I talk about in the book. Some scholars refer to this as paper genocide. So I start with this evening because this is a really rare glimpse. It's a trace. And as historians, that's all we really work with is traces from the past. Little slivers of information, shards of light that we try to unpack and make sense of to try and do justice to people's lives, their communities, their emotions, the sort of gamut of human experiences in the past. Oh, good, it worked. Okay. So keep this story in mind because I'm going to come back to why this is important and develop why this is important and why then Native people worked so hard over the course of the late 20th century and continue to work hard today to reclaim their gender roles and identities within their specific tribal communities, their tribal nations. The book is titled Reclaiming Two Spirits because that's what the people I worked with wanted this book to be titled. I was very deliberate in working with Two-Spirit elders and activists and just general, ordinary people like you and I who live in Indigenous communities who wanted their stories seen. There is this sense, rightly so, Native history is still tends to be caricatured and not fully seen on terms that Native people want it to be seen. And so I can talk about the method of how I went about trying to do that in this book as someone who's not only not Native, but not really American. Say about that, to begin with, is none of us are born with historical knowledge. We all have to work really hard to acquire it. And this is something that I think a lot of us do on a daily basis, and certainly in my job, I do it every day and never really stop thinking about it, much to the chagrin of my children. I mentioned traces, though. What you see on the screen are just 4 examples of the traces of knowledge information that have survived colonial invasion, boarding schools, attacks on languages, the whole range of settler colonial tools that were used to try and assimilate Native people into white society and to eliminate their sovereign nations, their culture, and their languages, thereby opening up these spaces for settler colonies. Despite all of that, language and knowledge still survive. Sometimes it went deeply underground, as I talk about in the book. But often people kept these stories alive in what was once called race talk. Conversations that occurred around the most intimate of family members and friends in the 19th century and the 20th century. We often see in the American West and Upper Midwest as it relates to issues of gender and sexuality in Native communities. So some of them survived the Navajo aakíí'skassi, which refers to an individual who is born with male sexual reproductive organs but takes on the roles of women or a woman in their life. Nadlehi refers to the singular. And it often is translated too as those who are changing or one who is constantly changing. Right? And in fact, all of these terms that I have on the screen here, the Lakota Winkte, the Hamane with the Cheyenne, and the various terms that the Cherokee have, including asege, which refers to queer, refer to action words, verbs, which is incredibly important to contextualize in a sort of linguistic but also a historical sense. Right? In Western languages, Latin-based languages, largely noun-based, right? And the sort of sense of gender that Europeans brought with them and imposed on societies that they tried to construct in what they called the New World were very rigidly categorized over time, and male and female being one set of those categories. That kind of stasis, that static notion of this is a woman, that's a man, that doesn't necessarily. Indeed, there's a great deal of fluidity because most native languages are verb-based. So, to give you an example, when I first started taking Cherokee language classes back in grad school, almost in the last century now, it's a long time ago, one of the things that the instructor told us in English is you've got to wrap your head around how Cherokee language speakers think. And so in English, for example, we would say, I see a whale. Whereas in Cherokee, it would be whale I see. So instantly, the syntax is changed to the point where the emphasis is on not on, but on the whale and on your relationship with the whale. And that relationship is always something that is managed, and indeed it is reciprocal. It needs to be carefully nurtured in indigenous cultural and social contexts. So right away, you begin to see a different way of seeing the world just in the way people use language. And that didn't really jibe with the increasingly rigid categories that Europeans.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but your mic is cutting out, so if you
Oh
mind,
no.
cut the
Let's cut this.
lavalier and use a pen. My apologies, my apologies.
It's all right. Is that better? Okay. All right. Now I'm like a rock star. Not really. So anyway, language is hugely important. Language is one of the traces that we're left with as students of indigenous cultures around the world. I also work with Indigenous Australians, so this is something that I'm very conscious of when I go in and work with sources and then work with people and get their sense on what these historical written sources might mean. Okay, all of that is important because we have a lot of stuff like this that happened over the course of the early modern period, 1500s, 1600s, so 16th, 17th century, in which, beginning with the Spanish, there were efforts to eliminate native people who took on gender fluid roles within their specific communities. This is a Theodore de Bry's rendering, wood carving of Balboa's attack on the Quava Indians and the so-called sodomites of Quava society in 1515. This is one of the, and I showed this image to a lot of the people I interviewed for the book, and it's still very much part of their sense of historical consciousness and a sense of historical, indeed, I would say, trauma. When we hear story, or when people I spoke to hear stories in the news about missing and murdered Indigenous women, or missing trans people, or two-spirit people, then often people think back on their relationship with settler colonial history, and in particular images like this. Right, so the story here with the Quava is that Balboa stumbles across this community in which there are people who are allegedly sodomites, and this is deeply offensive to the Spanish conquistadors, right? And particularly the ardently Catholic Balboa. And so what they do is they loose a technology of power on the Quava people, Spanish mastiffs. Dogs are used in all European flavors of settler colonialism in the Americas from almost the very beginning. Big attack dogs like the mastiffs you see there on the screen. And they're trained to attack and track down people. From native people who are quote-unquote sodomites, I'll unpack that term a little bit for you in a second, to enslaved people who abscond from slave plantations in upstate New York or in South Carolina. Right, it's one of the fundamental pillars of the technologies of power that settler colonists use to control people. So in this case, these Quava sodomites, okay, so there's some mystery about this, and historians have been very reluctant to take on the meaning behind who these people were, the Quava sodomites. So we have to begin, as I do in the book, by thinking about, well, what did sodomite and sodomy mean in the early modern period? And it doesn't necessarily mean what it means today, right? So sodomy could be a range of things, and it's about dinner time, so I'm going to spare you some of the graphic stories of bestiality from the early modern period. They were many, let me just say, in early modern America. Some of the ancestors of the Republic were up to some really strange things. With chickens. That's often the response of my students too, yes. And then disgust sets in. Sodomy covered a range of things, from masturbation to sex for non-reproductive purposes in marriage to masturbation, right? And it was written into Catholic theological treatises, and it was written into European laws, right? So were the Quasi-Sodomites homosexual in the sort of modern understanding of sodomy from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century? Well, we don't really know, to be honest. Was something else, was this language simply thrown around as a rationale to release these dogs onto these people who were deemed a threat to the Spanish conquistadors? Maybe. What we do know, and what I point out in other cases from the 16th century through the 19th century, is that terms like sodomite, hermaphrodite, badash, which I'll get to in more detail in a moment, were used quite freely and loosely by people of European ancestry to denote people who seem to keep changing their physical appearance and or engaging in relationships of an intimate nature that transcended or transgressed, I should say, heteronormative standards that Europeans tried to impose on the colonies. We also know that people labeled sodomites were often elders or knowledge keepers within their communities. So these are people who are charged with maintaining sacred knowledge for ceremony, for medicine. These are people charged with teaching youngsters, right? So it might not necessarily be that they're homosexual in a Western sense, or they're transcending their allotted, quote-unquote, biological gender. It just might be that they have a whole bunch of knowledge that knits this kinship community together, and we as colonizers really want the stuff that this society has. The land, the navigable rivers, the potential mineral wealth in the soil, and so on. And we do see this happen quite often. If you attack people with leadership and knowledge-keeping responsibilities in Native communities, it's a fast way to destabilize a society and then have your colonizer society move in the space that is provided, because Native people have a long tradition of fissuring, as it's called in anthropology, that is breaking up and then forming new kinship societies under the stresses of this type of violence. So this hangs over much of the history of people who we call today Two-Spirit. As all of this violence is going on, as I alluded to moments ago, there are examples of people who hold on to the ways and the knowledge of what it means to have a gender-fluid identity and take on gender-fluid roles, right? To embody both male and female spirits, which is the modern definition of Two-Spirit. Bia Wachichesh is one of those peoples, a gross venter warrior who was born into the gross venter society, taken captive by the Crow, nurtured in their fluid gender role and identity, was born male, but took on female roles, but also was really, really good at killing people on the battlefield. An excellent warrior, right? And so this kind of fluidity, this crossing of roles and assumed sort of stereotypical gender roles that we might associate with settler societies was not something that Native peoples really had much time for, because in their society the quest is for balance and harmony. It's a sort of a generalized way of talking about this quest to maintain this ever-changing, in an ever-changing world, this balance that is so elusive. There are different terms for this in different societies. The communities that I work most closely with, the Cherokee, the term that they have is tohi. Tohi refers to this balance or this flow. Biwa-Chiches kept the flow of the Gros Ventre moving in her role, transcending male and female, to ensure that members within her kinship community were knitted together in bonds of solidarity, in having them recognize that they were loved and nurtured by people within their respective community. Now, I come back then to that 1825 document, which is so rare. And I started with that because I was getting to this guy who you see on the screen there. That's George Catlin. Some of you may have heard of George Catlin. There's a few nods of heads there, yep. So George Catlin, for some of you in the room will know, made his name for himself as an artist and depicting Native societies, but also images from the American West and Upper Midwest, as we would know it today. One of the images that he portrayed was the dance of the Badash, which you see there on the screen. This is a Sac and Fox tradition where, according to Catlin, the warriors prepare for battle by dancing around, I don't know, does this thing have a pointer on it?
Yes, it does.
It does? Ah! No, I just turned it off. Sorry. Emergency. Is it the one in the middle? Ah.
Yeah, it will not show on an LCD.
Okay. Well then, never mind. Just quickly, right, that's the Badash figure right there. So, according to Catlin, the Sac and Fox were preparing for battle when he sketched this image and then made this painting subsequently, 1840s. They dance around the Badash, and then they all proceed to have anal sex with them, or them, according to Catlin. Okay, maybe not. I haven't spoken to any Two-Spirit Sac and Fox person today who can confirm that story, being at any time once part of their traditions. But what Catlin said about this, and what made that earlier 1825 document and all other written documents that I came across so rare, such rare traces of evidence, no matter how derogatory or offensive they were, was that Catlin made this image as an example of how inferior and degraded Native people were. Right? It was sort of a visual rationale for why they needed to be swept out of the way and American civilization spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. This was just a few years before Manifest Destiny became sort of the byword of American politics, right? Thanks to Andrew O'Sullivan, the Irish-American newspaper man. He also said, Catlin also said, that he wished that all knowledge of this tradition would be forgotten so that it would no longer be written about. Right? There's a certain attempt or hope, an aspiration for knowledge of these gender-fluid roles and traditions to be erased from the historical record. And I alluded to genocide earlier. genocide takes on many, many forms. It's not only violence and the mass destruction of human bodies, it's that and so much more. It's the work of missionaries. It's the work of people who received the documents from family members who were early colonists and decided that some documents are not worthy of archiving, so we'll just get rid of those and burn them in the back shed. Now, I've been at this history racket for a few years now, and back in 2012, I published a book called Slave Breeding about coercive reproductive practices and violence on the southern plantations of the United States. And what I learned from that study was that there were an awful lot of families in the American South after the Civil War who, when they donated their fathers or grandfathers' papers to special collections and archives throughout the United States, donated those collections with curious omissions in the middle, pages missing from personal diaries. And these were often the places where people didn't expect anyone to see these documents, but put down their deepest and darkest thoughts and deeds. Right? And we know this from a number of many other surviving diaries from the antebellum period. So the gaps in the historical written record, the archive of colonialism, is something that follows many forms of history, from the history of enslavement to the history of Native people and their gender traditions and fluid gender roles that they took on. And Catlin embodies that. Just keeping an eye on the time. Okay, so I mentioned this term badash. This is a term with ancient Arabic etymological roots, and it refers to someone who is a kept boy or a sex slave. It sometimes refers to pederasty, so that sort of ancient Mediterranean tradition of keeping a young boy for sexual purposes under the pretense of educating that child. This is the term that was applied to people we know today as two-spirit, those who have male and female spirits within them. It's a term that was used by historians, by anthropologists, by psychologists and social scientists across multiple disciplines. And it's important, and I talk at some length about this in the book with a particular case study, because the intent of the scholars and the journalists who went into these communities and used this term and then sort of elaborated on it in their written works, both scholarly and popular, was to underscore how debauched and degraded Native communities were. Right? It sort of fed into the stereotypes that white people had of Native communities. And what's interesting about this is this term, badash, was at its very peak in American popular understandings of Native American sexuality and gender roles in the late 19th century and early 20th century, at about the same time that terms like redskin were being used and applied to professional and college sports teams throughout the country. Right? So there's a whole cultural infrastructure that is circulating here in the Gilded Age and so-called progressive era in American history that places Native Americans, for want of a better way of describing this, outside of history. They're stuck in traditions that are really quite degraded and out of place in American society. So the intent then, as I say, to reiterate, was to reinforce the exceptionalism of the United States, and particularly of Anglo-Americans. Fast forward, though, to the 1970s, and things really do begin to change, and change quite rapidly. My in-laws, I shouldn't say this because they might see it on the internet, but I'll say it anyway. My in-laws believe the 60s was the decade that ruined America and the 70s reinforced it. Thank God. In the 1970s, these two people were among a number who led movements to change the way not only white Americans saw gay and lesbian Indians, as they were then called, but how every American viewed gay and lesbian Indians. This is Randy Burns and Barbara Cameron. Barbara Cameron, I should point out, one of my intellectual heroes. She passed away from cancer much too early in life. She was in her mid to late 40s. It was the late 1990s, and she had so much more to give. A force of nature. And with Randy Burns in the 1970s, they moved from their reservation communities where Randy in particular faced extensive homophobia and discrimination. And they came to go to college, right? And they got caught up in the sort of the tumult and the excitement of the American Indian movement in the Bay Area in the 1970s. And from that, they got the sense that, well, we're good at organizing, and we're pretty darn smart, so we can start our own organizations for gay and lesbian Indians, because there was none. There simply weren't any in the mid to late 1970s. What's more, go to any American city in the 1970s and into the early 1980s, and what you will find is many of the gay clubs, the leather clubs, the bathhouses, racially excluded people of color. African Americans, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and certainly Native Americans. Right? And so one of the things that Randy and Barbara became famous for in the Bay Area was organizing flash mobs that would go to these clubs and insist on their entry into them. But before that, what they formed was the Bay Area, they formed the Gay American Indians, GAY, G-A-I. And GAI was designed originally as a social club where people who had come from throughout the United States, Native people who were gay or lesbian, could come and sort of form a sense of community, right? So they put on drag shows, they had potlucks, they enjoyed each other's company, they got drunk a lot apparently. All very normal stuff for people in their late teens and 20s to do. But then things really started to get serious with gay backlash beginning to gather momentum during the latter decades of the 70s, and then AIDS happened. And the party just totally stopped, right? And people realized that they had to get very serious very fast if they wanted this organization that they had founded to become something more than a party group. And they did that. They became very efficient at activating people and getting seen by local, state, and federal politicians. They got people within the LGBT community. It wasn't yet Q on the end of it because Q was still a slur at this time in the early 80s. And it's from that. This is the seed then. And from this seed of gay American Indians would germinate a whole series of gay and lesbian organizations throughout the United States and Canada. And they would begin to have these big old, what are essentially powwows, where people would come together from around North America, and as I discovered in the course of researching the book, from as far away as Australia, gay Aboriginal men were invited to attend these events. The first of which was held in 1988. So there were two held, 1988 in just outside of Denver, 89 in Minneapolis, and then 1990. 1990 was Winnipeg, just outside of Winnipeg in Canada. And it's at that event that people debated this issue of labeling, naming, right? Because there was this sense that we are more than just gay and or lesbian Indians. Right? This doesn't really capture the full cultural and historical essence of our roles and the roles of people like us, our ancestors' roles in the past. Right? We were more than gay. We were more than what we would say today as than queer. What's more, the face of the person living with HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, throughout the 1980s, was a young white male. It's really hard to get any media attention, and it was really hard to get tribal leaders to take HIV/AIDS seriously. They thought it was a colonizer disease, and some people told the people I interviewed that very thing, that this is a white man's disease, it doesn't affect us because homosexuality is something that colonizers brought to the Americas. I don't have time to unpack that. Suffice it to say, I unpack it in the book, and it's a whole thing. Anyway, long story short, this Ojibwe term, a Northern Algonquin term, Nij Manitowoc, was decided upon. It was in honor of the Ojibwe lands that they were having this gathering on in 1990. It also captured, in a really clear and poetic way, who people thought they were at the time and the type of roles that they took on within their communities and that their ancestors who had similar identities took on. Right? This sort of two-spirited, it literally translates as two-spirit Nij Manitowoc. Male and female spirits within a single person. And this was the term that was decided upon. And out of this gathering in Winnipeg in 1990, people were absolutely beside themselves with excitement. Right? I quote people in the book saying, "We have made history. This is going to change everything. People are going to finally see us for who we are." Right? Because there was this sense, and there still is some of this in some Native communities in the West, that the whole gay and lesbian thing is really a Western thing. It's very decadent. It's consumeristic. It's colonizer culture. It's not us, is what I heard from a lot of people. And so this started to cut through some of that and the resistance. And slowly, over time, attention was garnered for HIV/AIDS awareness, safe sex practices. So these types of packaging on condoms was distributed throughout Native communities. And there's a reason that these are so important in the message of trying to protect and save lives, because a lot of the communities that we're talking about, Upper Midwest, the Great Plains, out into the West, very small communities where people were really, really anxious about gossip within their communities, and the type of homophobia or transphobia that they might encounter in the context of the early 1990s if they came out. And so this was one way of just saying, everyone, HIV/AIDS doesn't discriminate, please practice safe sex practices. And then there are these other messages that speak to the heart of sort of self-worth and self-esteem, and really trying to say to people that you genuinely are loved and people care about you in our communities. Right? You carry some sacred flame, something sacred that is special within you that we need. And in fact, this is something, as I write about in the book, that comes full circle at Standing Rock, where the Two-Spirit Camp plays a major role in opposition to the Black Snake, as it was called by folks at Standing Rock. Okay, I'm conscious of time, and I want to get to your questions. Suffice to say that Two-Spirit activism and community work and politics and history making continues. I am but one person who cares deeply about some people who got me into this project to begin with, who suggested it'd be a really good idea if we had a history book that actually explained things to people in non-jargony terms and didn't emphasize all the wars. Like, as one of my friends said to me, Indians did more than just fight white people. They fought amongst themselves, they loved each other, they laughed, they invented, they did the whole range of things that human beings did and do. And so the image you see on the screen there, and I'll conclude with this, this was the last powwow before the Bay Area powwow before COVID hit, 2019. This past February was the first time that folks have got together in person again. It's probably the biggest Two-Spirit powwow in the United States and Canada. I wasn't able to attend, but I heard it was a wonderful event where people were just so relieved to be able to share a laugh and a meal and hug each other and be together again and know that they have come through yet another foreign pathogen in one piece. So I'll conclude there and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How wonderfully complicated history is. Questions?
Yes, ma'am. Oh, microphone?
Yeah, go ahead and take.
This started with you were talking about the males who were dressing as women and perform. But what about the women? Did they have women that? And it looked like that they were really down on the men and having dogs eat the men. But what about the women? That was okay, I guess, or?
That's a great question. Yeah. So there are absolutely people who are born with female reproductive organs who take on men's roles. They don't exist as often in the written archive of colonialism as men who take on women's roles. And there's a reason for that. That they are there, and I do talk about them in the book, but the reason is that European archives were mostly written by men. And men, European men, were absolutely disgusted and appalled by men who debased themselves, very common word, and took on women's roles. Did cooking and cleaning and tended to children, much less having same-sex relationships, right? That was to effeminize yourself. And Thomas Jefferson talks about this, actually. The effeminate nature of native men, right? It was a sign of both their weakness and savagery at the same time. So, culturally, the European authors of all of these documents that we historians have to work with emphasize overwhelmingly men, quote-unquote, men who dress as women, right? And that is something, why would you do that? Why would you want to present yourself as weaker than you should be or are in reality? Additionally, Europeans, but particularly the English, really didn't like people who changed their physical appearance in public. They thought they were not being authentic to their true self and that they were hiding something. This is something that really I see this so often in English archival documents from the 17th century through, in fact, to the early 20th century.
But it's offensive for a man to be like, oh, but a woman can be a tomboy, and that's fine.
So it is and it isn't, right? So there's still the same concerns about a person is not projecting publicly their true, authentic nature, right? And so we constantly have these conversations in the United States and other settler colonies about authenticity. And a lot of this is where it comes from, these early colonial days where the colonizers were obsessed with authenticity and one's true, authentic nature because what they were concerned about was policing people's behavior. They needed order, in a place that made them feel really uneasy, the wilderness. So there's still concern, to answer your question, there's still concern with women who take on the roles of men. Biuachichesh, who I showed up on the screen there, was really a cause of some concern for French fur traders. They were really concerned about who this person really was. Was she a witch? And there's a lot of examples of this from that part of the world. The approach is different, though. And the approach becomes very different by the mid-19th century when we begin to see a push towards the medicalization of knowledge about the Badash. And so it becomes far more common to see records left where, quote-unquote, women who are acting as men in public are forced to submit to medical examinations to figure out their quote-unquote true self. There's less inclination to do that with women, men who are taking on the roles of women. And there are some reasons for that I suggest in the book, but what I suspect is going on there in that case is getting an insight into the misogyny of early medicine. Yeah.
Anyone else? Questions? Come on, there you go.
When you say two-spirit, overall, it's not just about gender fluidity, it's about queerness as well? Is that true?
Right, so it is today, yeah. So since Two-Spirit was coined in 1990, and this is something I take up in the book because there's a lot of younger people who actually see Two-Spirit as a little old-fashioned now and prefer terms like indigiqueer, which I don't know, it sounds a little clunky and academic to me. But that's what that's what some of the younger Two-Spirit indigiqueer people are going for. But yes, so it does now encompass, because the term queer has been reclaimed. Right. Since the early to mid 1990s, when that term started to be reclaimed
100%.
and inverted, yeah, then it's been. But you know what's interesting about that, and I talk about this in the book, is that some of the older Two-Spirit folks who can remember the 60s and 70s, they just can't use the term.
Right.
It has too many dark, bad memories and connotations for them. And actually, really bad memories and connotations from within their own kinship communities, which is what hurts the most. You can ignore white people calling you queer. That hurts too, but it doesn't hurt as much as someone within your kinship community calling you queer. So it's complex, layered. There's generational differences. This is why history is always changing, because people have different perspectives on it.
What was the scale of this dual spirit or whatever you call it?
What was the scale of Two-Spirit people? Well,
what percentage?
We don't know for certain, but if we go based upon the percentage of trans and gay and lesbian people in current Native society, it's small. It's like 1 out of every 150 or so, 200 people. And that will change and differ based on different communities. In some communities, they will have more people with gender fluid roles and identities than others. Some communities don't have a tradition of gender fluidity at all. There's, last time I checked, around 547 federally recognized tribes, thereabouts. The number may have changed since I last checked, but so you're talking about an Indian country, as it's popularly referred to, is a very diverse place. Not everyone thinks alike, and not everyone agrees on things. So, yeah, it's going to vary. But yeah, the numbers, relatively speaking, the numbers will invariably be small, but the role that those people play in those respective societies will be quite significant, because they will take on this role of mediating disputes and differences between people who adopt normative male and female roles within society.
making a differentiation, I don't need it, between people, because I assume that in any culture or community,
Yeah.
the percentage of non-straight people is pretty consistent. So if you're making a differentiation between people who are not straight versus people who identify as two-spirit.
Well, it's not only people who are not straight in Native communities. So in Native communities, you will have people who are two-spirit, but won't call themselves gay or lesbian.
So that's what I'm saying, you're differentiating.
There is that differentiation, yeah, and that comes from a sort of deep sense and respect for growing up in what's called tradition and culture. And so, yeah, so I've met people, just to give you an example, I've met people who are gay. They're happy to call themselves a gay Cherokee man, but they're not two-spirit. They don't believe that they deserve that title or have earned that title, right? So yeah, and again, I go back to language, which I started talking a little bit about. In Cherokee languages, there's 13 or 14 different words or phrases to denote gender roles and activities within Cherokee society. So very different from how we in the West understand these concepts in very binaristic terms.
Do you have more of your basis for this coming from the colonial archives, their take on things or their written word, versus the actual native stories or traditions?
I'm so glad someone asked me that question. Yeah, so what I did with this book is, it began with brunch in the Castro, actually in San Francisco with a friend of mine. And then it sort of spread out to me doing archival research. So going in and finding every single mention I could of people who had gender fluid identities or roles or whatever the case may be in the terms that were used by Europeans. So that was my starting point, right? Very conventional historical research. And then what I did was many of the people that I worked with and interviewed for the book, I took these sources and these images to them. I'm like, what is your interpretation of this? Right, so how can we read between the lines of what these colonizers were reporting? And in some cases, the report or the mention of the people who are known today as Two-Spirit came in like logbooks or account books, right? Places you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? And so in some sense, they're very candid reflections that just popped into someone's mind and they put it in a note in the note section of the account book. But anyway, I took these and sometimes I read them to people and got their response because I wanted to get at this sense of history making, how we interpret and make meaning out of documents that were bequeathed to us by people that we have no necessary way of relating to, but we need to try and get into their heads somehow, and we need to try and then also flip what they're saying around to get at what some of the elders might have been saying about something similar that was happening at that time. So I did that in addition to doing standard stock oral history interviews with folks for the book. I took the sources and I basically, I tried to indigenize them through the people I worked with. Those of you who have been around college campuses, institutions like this, you might have heard a lot about decolonization over the last 10 or 20 years. I don't think it goes far enough. I want to indigenize these sources. What do indigenous people think about them? And how can that, in turn, inform my writing as a historian?
Any conversations with Pamunkey or Powhatan people as you further search?
Some, but there's not a lot of ongoing, those traditions are being remade as we speak, right? So a lot of Algonquin-speaking, Southern Algonquin-speaking people in this region of the world, what is actually happening is people, as they're reconnecting with culture and language, have found, because of earlier colonial wars, genocides, boarding schools, language and culture has been lost. And so a lot of language immersion work that's being done, incidentally by Two-Spirit people, and Two-Spirit people in the South too, I should point out, is that they're going to other communities who have similar language traditions, and they're learning from them, and then they're coming back to community, and they're having conversations within their respective communities to create new stories about who they are in this current moment, right? So it's not simply about dredging up stuff from the long ago past. It's about, sometimes if necessary, creating new traditions, new stories. Yeah, totally. It's totally in the tradition. And in that sense, it's very traditional. Yeah, in the verb tradition of native languages.
I'm going to bring, because we want to be able to hear you on Facebook.
Okay, well, I don't have a question, but I did want to make the statement. I applaud you for the research that you did here and bringing this knowledge public. It's such a lost, I want to say, beauty in showing how we're such broad people in general, and just not keeping us binary in terms and traditions that were made, you know. So.
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? We are just at 8 o'clock. Anyone? All right. Well, Professor Smithers, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you for your wonderful work.
Thank you.
That is pushing forward this very important and difficult to access story. So thank you for that as well.
And head over to the gift store.
And the book is for sale. Take them all the way down the stack except the one on the bottom is mine. And remember all of those things that I mentioned that are going on this month. At the first of this meeting, we have brochures out on the desk that you can take with you that will give you specifics. So I don't have to recount that. So thank you very much for coming out again tonight. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.